Think about the last time you bought something made far away. The supply chain behind it, the ships, the ports, the agreements did not appear overnight. The same was true 1,000 years ago. Merchants had already mapped the world before most rulers knew what lay beyond their borders. They built roads out of habit and trust out of necessity. And in doing so, they created the foundations that empires would one day stand on. This is a story about how trade routes became power routes, and how the people who moved goods across the ancient world quietly changed who ruled it. We often think of empires as things built by kings, by armies, by decisions made in palaces and war rooms, and those things mattered, but they tell only part of the story. Before a king could collect taxes from a distant city, someone had to build a relationship with that city first. Before a government could project power across a sea, someone had to learn how to cross that sea safely. Before any empire expanded, a merchant usually got there first. Merchants are easy to overlook in history. They leave fewer monuments than generals. They win no famous battles. Their names are rarely carved into stone. But their networks, the routes they built, the relationships they maintained, the financial systems they created, those things shaped the world in ways that armies alone never could. So here is the question worth sitting with. What if the real engine of the empire was not military power? What if it was something quieter, something more patient? Something built one trade agreement at a time. Let us go back to the beginning. Long before there were empires in the modern sense, there were merchants. And merchants had one simple goal: move goods from where they were plentiful to where they were scarce. Make a profit in between. This sounds simple, but doing it well required something remarkable. It required trust. And trust, in a world without phones or legal contracts or international courts, was hard to build and easy to lose. Early merchant communities solved this problem in a very human way. Families and communities would spread their members across different cities and regions. Each member became a trusted contact in a new place. Trade ran through relationships, not institutions. If you needed to send goods from one city to another, you did not rely on a stranger. You relied on a cousin, a family friend, someone whose word was already known. This system worked, and it worked remarkably well. One of the earliest clear examples comes from the ancient Assyrian merchants of around 2000 BCE. Traders from the city of Ashur set up small commercial colonies called Kairems across Anatolia, what is now modern Turkey. They traded tin and textiles for silver and gold. They kept meticulous records on clay tablets. They wrote letters home describing prices, disputes, and road conditions. These were not kings or generals. They were business people. But their network connected two distant regions. It created economic relationships that lasted for generations. And it demonstrated something important. Long-distance trade was possible if you built the right system of trust. The same pattern appeared elsewhere across the ancient world. Phoenician sailors built trading settlements across the Mediterranean as early as 1200 BCE. Dravidian merchants from South India traded with the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. Chinese merchants moved silk and ceramics along inland and coastal routes long before any formal Silk Road policy was established by any government. None of these networks were designed from the top down. No government built them. They grew because individual merchants saw opportunity. And they survived because they kept delivering value year after year, generation after generation. Let us look more closely at three of history's most powerful merchant networks. Each one reveals something important about how commerce and empire became deeply tangled together. The first is Venice. By the year 1000 CE, Venice was a small island city in northern Italy. It had no farmland, no forests, no significant natural resources. What it had was a position. A city sitting between the Byzantine Empire to the east and the kingdoms of Western Europe to the west. Venice used that position brilliantly. Venetian merchants built relationships with Byzantine rulers and Arab traders alike. They carried silks, spices, and glassware westward. They carried silver and wool eastward. Over time, they became indispensable to both sides. Neither east nor west could easily afford to cut them off. But Venice did not stop at trade. It built something more durable, a commercial infrastructure. Venetian merchants developed some of the earliest forms of insurance contracts and investment partnerships. They created the commenda, an early business agreement where one partner provided capital and another provided labor and took on the physical risk of a voyage. Profits were divided. Losses were divided too. This was not just clever finance. It was a system that allowed Venice to scale. More merchants could take more voyages with less personal risk. The network expanded. So did Venetian influence across the region. By the 1200s, Venice was one of the most powerful cities in the entire Mediterranean world, not because it had the largest army, but because it controlled the most important commercial relationships in the region. When the Fourth Crusade redirected its forces to sack Constantinople in 1204, Venice played a central role. The city-state gained trading ports, island territories, and commercial privileges that extended its reach across the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. A merchant city had helped reshape the political map of a continent. The second example is the Arab merchant network across the Indian Ocean. Arab traders had been sailing the Indian Ocean for centuries before the rise of Islam in the 7th century CE. They understood the monsoon winds. They knew the seasonal routes. They had already built relationships with port cities stretching from East Africa to South Asia and into Southeast Asia. When Islam spread rapidly out of Arabia, it brought something that merchants needed deeply: a shared legal and ethical framework. Islamic commercial law established clear rules about contracts, debts, and trade partnerships. It gave merchants from different lands a common language of trust. This was transformative. An Arab merchant could travel thousands of miles from home and still operate within a familiar system. He could make agreements with partners he had never personally met. The shared framework reduced uncertainty. It made long-distance trade faster and more reliable across an enormous geography. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Arab merchant networks formed a continuous commercial thread connecting East Africa to India, Southeast Asia, and China. Ivory, gold, cotton, porcelain, and spices moved across thousands of miles of open ocean. Cities along these routes prospered. Rulers who welcomed Arab traders gained access to taxable commerce and long-lasting economic relationships. Political influence followed trade. It often does. The third example is the European merchant companies of the 16th and 17th centuries. By the 1500s, European powers were pushing outward into the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. But it was not governments alone that drove this expansion. It was merchant capital, organized into companies, funded by private investors, and operating with a commercial discipline that state bureaucracies could not easily match. The Dutch East India Company, known by its initials as the VOC, is the most striking example. Founded in 1602, it was essentially a merchant network granted the powers of a state. It could sign treaties with foreign rulers. It could wage war. It could build fortresses. It could govern conquered territories. All of this in pursuit of commercial advantage. The VOC did not expand to spread a religion. It did not expand to serve a monarch's ambitions. It expanded to control supply chains. It wanted dominance over the spice trade in the Maluku Islands. It wanted to eliminate competitors and set its own prices. These were purely commercial goals, but their political consequences were enormous. At its peak, the VOC operated across Asia, Africa, and parts of the Americas. It employed tens of thousands of people. In some regions, it issued its own currency. It was, in many ways, an empire wearing a merchant's coat. What Venice, the Arab networks, and the VOC all share is one underlying pattern. They did not wait for governments to open the doors. They opened the doors themselves, and governments followed them through. There is a reason this pattern repeated across so many centuries and so many cultures. Merchant networks were solving real problems, and the solutions they built had a way of outlasting any single ruler or dynasty. The first problem was information. A merchant traveling far from home needs to know things. What are prices like in that city? Is the road still safe? Who can be trusted? Merchant networks solved this through continuous communication. Agents and partners sent letters, reports, and updates. Over time, these networks became among the best information systems in the world. Rulers who cultivated relationships with merchants gained access to intelligence they could not have gathered any other way. The second problem was capital. Large-scale trade required more money than any single person usually possessed. Merchant networks invented financial tools to solve this. Letters of credit, partnership contracts, early forms of banking and deposit-taking. These instruments allowed merchants to pool resources and distribute risk. They also gave rise to something historically new, a class of people whose wealth was not tied to land or title. This gave them independence, and independence quietly gave them influence. The third problem was enforcement. How do you make someone honor an agreement when there is no court to appeal to, no judge to call? Merchant communities solved this through reputation. A merchant who cheated once would quickly find that the entire network knew about it. Trust was the operating currency of the system, and losing it was more expensive than any single deal was worth. Together, information systems, financial tools, and reputation-based enforcement, These solutions created networks of remarkable durability. They could survive wars, famines, and the deaths of individual members. The network itself was the most valuable asset. Governments eventually understood this. Some taxed merchant networks. Some formed deliberate partnerships with them. Some, like Venice and later the Dutch Republic, essentially became commercial powers themselves. And those states that worked with their merchants, rather than against them, tended to grow wealthier and more durable over time. This pattern did not end with the ancient world or the age of exploration. In the 18th and 19th centuries, merchant banking families like the Rothschilds built networks connecting the financial capitals of Europe. They moved information and capital faster than most governments could manage. Rulers across Europe needed their loans to fund armies and wars. These merchant banking networks influenced, and sometimes quietly shaped, political outcomes across the continent. In East Asia, Chinese merchant communities, historically known as the Overseas Chinese, established trade networks across Southeast Asia long before European colonial powers arrived in force. They settled in port cities from Manila to Batavia to Singapore. They built commercial relationships that crossed ethnic, religious, and political lines. Their networks kept trade flowing even as political borders shifted around them. The British East India Company tells a similar story. Like the VOC before it, it began as a purely commercial enterprise. Its charter was about profit, not empire, but profit required security. Security required control, and control over time became governance. By the mid-1800s, a company originally founded to trade cotton and spices was effectively administering a subcontinent of hundreds of millions of people. The underlying logic was always the same. Merchants built the roads. States followed the roads. Power collected at the intersections. In the late 19th century, the United States followed a version of this pattern too. Railroad companies opened the American West before formal governance structures arrived. Commercial settlements grew into cities before legislatures had time to keep up. Commerce and political authority moved together, with commerce almost always leading. These examples span continents and centuries. The details differ greatly, but the underlying pattern holds. Where merchants built durable networks, political power tended to accumulate, not always immediately, not always peacefully, but consistently and persistently. History rewards patience, and few actors in history have been more patient than merchants quietly working their roots year after year, generation after generation. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that political power rarely emerges from nowhere. It follows paths. And many of those paths were first opened by merchants. When Venice became a Mediterranean power, it did not begin with an army. It began with a ship and a trade agreement. When Arab civilization spread across the Indian Ocean, it traveled on the same seasonal winds that traders had been reading for centuries. When European nations built their global empires, they built them on the commercial foundations that merchant companies had already laid, brick by careful brick. Merchants are often missing from the front pages of history. They do not appear at the great battles or the grand signing ceremonies, but they are almost always there in the background, moving goods, building trust, solving problems quietly while others were making speeches. Every merchant who extended credit to a faraway partner was placing a quiet bet on the future. Every trader who learned a new language was constructing a bridge that others would eventually walk across. Every commercial route that proved reliable and safe became, in time, a corridor for political influence. Commerce is patient in a way that armies simply are not. It does not need to win a battle. It just needs to keep showing up. And that, more than almost anything else, explains how merchant networks quietly shape the rise and sometimes the fall of empires. The trade does not always make the headlines, but it almost always makes history.